who am I? Well, I am a 16-year veteran working in various capacities of design and art. The last 10 years has been largely in design, and I was the lead level designer on Scarface. I've worked on a variety of other games, Star Siege and Tribes and stuff, and I'm a senior designer at Slant Six, but I am currently the lead campaign designer for the Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. The context of what we're going to be talking about today is what is an intellectual property, an established intellectual property, and what we can do with it. Let me just kind of start off. Who here knows what an IP is? There's a whole lot of hands. All right, so good. Anyone here who doesn't know what an IP is? More importantly, an established IP. Any hands at all? There's one. Okay, good. I'll explain it real quick. An IP is intellectual property. Most of you seem to know that, and those that don't should be ashamed. An established IP is a little bit of a different thing. So to explain, an established IP is basically something that a pre-existing license of some sort. So in my background, I've worked with things that are movies and existing comic books, video games, anything like that. But basically an established IP is something that already exists, that either as a game or something we're going to bring into games. So that's important because everything we're talking about today is relating to how do you deal with suddenly taking on an established IP and making it into a game or another game out of it. So that'll be the sort of gist of it. A big question here, of course, is who owns the IP, and that's going to keep coming up again and again when we're talking about constraints, which we'll be getting into. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, the question, who owns the IP? Basically, what I'd like to do is get to the brass tacks of defining the constraints for working with an IP, and then how that can actually help you deal with that IP in a creative way. Basically, by limiting yourself, you can be a bit more creative, and I think that's extremely important. So, of course, I've learned most of this the hard way, because you suddenly go into something like Scarface, and you're like, how do you design for this? And it has a whole wealth of questions that then come up, and lots of floundering until you sort of figure out how to deal with it. So hopefully, I can spare you some of that torment. So an example of an established IP, Scarface. This one you're dealing with a film that's 20 years old, and you're going to make a game out of it. It's very easy to think, okay, well, we're just going to copy GTA, because that doesn't work in a whole bunch of ways, which we'll come back to in a little bit. But effectively here, you're dealing with, well, the question, who are the owners? Well, at this point, you start dealing with the actor, which, believe it or not, had bearing. You deal with likeness rights. You deal with production companies that are responsible for the license, which after 20 years, a whole bunch of people have fingers in that pie. Universal's a big part of it. There's music groups that are involved. There's all kinds of stuff. So it gets fairly complex and keeps your producers very, very busy, and your legal team and their legal teams very busy. But it's good to identify that very early on, because then you know, as you come up with questions to ask, who are you asking them to? Because that'll be a key part of defining your constraints. Another example of an established IP would be Captain America. Captain America, basically 70 years old last year, and it goes back to 1941 with a comic book. There he is socking Hitler in the jaw. So then you've got a movie, and then you've got a game. Now the game is tied into the film. So suddenly you have to look at constraints about, well, can I just make a game and use anything I want from the 70 years of history of comic books? Am I allowed to do? And very quickly those answers are no. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. But you have to really define, where do you live? And are you just directly telling the film or not, and that kind of stuff. There's a whole bunch, and we'll get back into that in a little bit. The big thing that comes up with dealing with established franchises is that you have to figure out then whether or not your game is a reboot or an installment or an update. Those are completely different directions for how you're going to design for the game that you're going to make with that IP. So if it's a sequel, well, then you're basically just working with what you've got and you move forward. And that seems fairly obvious. And like, okay, cool, and the next adventure for whatever. But when you're trying to reboot, it's completely different, because your questions then become much more about, well, what are we rebooting? Who are we speaking to? And some of the questions that we're going to get into as we talk about constraints and about identifying your target audience are, what do you do with that franchise? In our case, with Resident Evil, we're given in our particular case, we're given the very fun adventure of going into an established piece of Resident Evil's very rich history and working at it, kind of like Back to the Future 2, where we're going behind the scenes and working sideways from it. So we're extending the story in a very sideways direction And at the same time, we have to be careful not to conflict with any of the established canon moments. And we'll come back to how you define canon. So the first thing about identifying constraints is that you need to look at identifying the constraints that you have to deal with for story, narrative, characters, and established histories. This is, I'm going to pop forward here, a huge thing. Resident Evil, for example, has a massive amount of background story, and their continuities don't all agree. So, and that's putting it lightly. So, you know, and there's toy lines, there's all sorts of merchandising, there's films, but the same characters pop up over and over and over again. So for us looking at it, and I'm not taking full accountability of this, there's a whole wealth of people that were involved in this process. But what it's come down to is we really focused on the core monsters and the core characters and on settings that were iconic, and then worked our gameplay through there. And I'll come back a little bit to how we resolve some of that, but a big thing is just defining which canon is actually the one. So you can eliminate a lot of the white noise and sort of background noise of things that are not going to be relevant. So, okay, we're not looking at the comics, cool. And those are questions you would have to, for us, would push back to Capcom, but you push back to whoever owns the IP that you're taking on, whether it's internal or external. These are the questions: which story can we use? Which character is a fair game? You know, what can we do with them? Are we allowed to kill them off? Those are all simple questions you can ask up front that have ramifications throughout the entire breadth of the design. The next thing, to go back one slide, publisher time, technology, budget, and staffing. That's the reality of a project. It's how much money have you got, how much time have you got, how many crew do you have, are you using an out-of-box engine, do you have an engine, the big question that project after project tends to burn us a bit is we get into something and it all sounds good and it sounds like stuff we can do, and then you find out that the tech debt is actually a lot bigger than we realized. And that's, you know, any game could potentially run into that, and probably will at some point or other. But if you identify up front at least boxes of how much you're going to allow for tech debt, or these are features that if we do this, we're going to need to build something for that. If we're going to have four-person co-op, do we already have a four-person co-op system? In Slant Six case, yes, we do. But we're now putting a game on 360, so that will be some new R&D stuff that we'll need to do because we haven't previously put a game onto that platform. So those are the things you want to identify early on, because that becomes a very key constraint for deciding how much you can do in developing your design for your new exciting adventure game or whatever. The associated marketing and merchandise and tie-ins, this one's a strange one because it's weird to think in pre-production you're worrying about your marketing and merchandise and tie-ins, but you need to, especially with someone else's, with an established IP, you have to be concerned about where else it's keyed into, and if you're like, it's an easy one. For for Captain America, that had a movie schedule, so we knew that we were tied to a release date. But at the same time, our game wasn't directly telling the film, so there was a lot of discrepancy between what we were doing and what they were doing, and that was a tough one to work through. But in the end, we knew what our schedule was, and that helped to kind of work backwards towards what we were doing and what we were tied into. Associated marketing, we had a real, unfortunately, kind of in a black box about what exactly was going to happen with the Captain America case. So, but for Scarface, we pushed on that really hard, and it turned out that the more we pushed on it, the more we got involved and were aware of what was happening with marketing, with different kind of cross promotions and stuff, the more opportunities that rose up. And it was actually good because while it didn't necessarily affect our campaign design, it did help us to tie some things in that made sense with what we were doing for marketing or for merchandise. And it opened up some opportunities, and that's a good thing. External concerns like actors and license rights. I mentioned this before with Scarface. Al Pacino's, to even have him involved at all with the project meant that his legal team had to be involved. And basically, if we wanted the character to even look like him or sound like him, he had to be involved. And then because Scarface, even though he was famous for films prior to that, his real kind of break as pop icon or pop culture icon was Scarface. So he's extremely concerned about the image and portrayal. And he was worried that we were just going to make a brutal killer that ran around destroying everything. And while some of that is true, there were definite constraints that came forward by his involvement with it. That Tony Montana's moral code became a very, very key aspect as to why he was agreeable with working with us. And that was always kind of a factor. It was a very light factor, but it was a significant one because that's the main character of the game. So as I was saying, with Resident Evil, when we're establishing constraints, a big part of it too is you need to evaluate and establish basically who your potential fans are, and then appreciate those. Both you're looking at, I mean, for our game in particular, we're looking at branching into a genre of gameplay that RE hasn't been in previously. while they have done a bit more action, they haven't done a 4-person co-op shooter style approach to their content before. And that's a fairly significant thing, because if you look at the classic history, especially the particular time frame that we're looking at the games, the older games are survival horror and have a very, very heavy puzzle influence. Whereas if you look at a 4-person co-op game, that's generally much more on the side of it's a shooter. Your inventory systems tend to be a lot lighter. You don't have a lot of RPG elements really, and there are a lot of design choices that have to go towards satisfying a shooter fan. So when we look at solving that, because basically what we won't want to do is alienate the existing IP fans, but we have to find some way of keeping them on board, or at least addressing their concerns. And also, I mean, at the same time, yes, some are going to be disappointed that we're not putting a lot of huge elaborate puzzles or massive inventory menus or whatever into our game. And okay, we've kept it fairly streamlined. However, there are little things we can do, such as the classic kind of iconic herb that's in the potted plant, which I always found really funny as a kid. That we have that, and it's okay. That makes sense. It's a nice nod. And bringing in key characters and really bringing those up, and bringing in key monsters and sort of the iconic monsters and fleshing them out and giving them more of a presence and giving them more exposure in the narrative, so that players have a chance to really kind of see them in a fresh way and engage them in a different way, because the tool set for engagement is different. And again, then the fun that comes with having 4 people playing together, and all of that sort of competitive stuff. So yeah, that's basically why you want to figure out where you sit and with your fans, or who your fans are trying to be, or who your fans are. With Scarface, and this is really important, we basically came to the point of looking at, okay, well, why is it that people like Scarface so much? What is it they like? Why did the re-release of the DVD sell so well? Because that was a factor for us getting funded. And then it became a very key factor in how much are we going to be funded to do that project. And looking at it, we realized that, okay, well, rappers sample Scarface a lot and seem to identify with it, but rappers aren't our core audience. They're a reflection of our core audience. So then we look at who are the audience for the rappers that are sampling Scarface. And you look into that and you start to find that it's all the kids in Middle America that are listening to rap, or they're buying shirts and blinging out or whatever. And that's not the complete fan base, but that gives us a sampling of who the fan base is. And it kind of says, okay, that's where we're going to draw the line for our target audience. And then we can skew towards that. What is it that they like then about Scarface? And you look at it from the other side, like, well, the movie, it's cool and it's got the violent scenes or whatever, but there's a wealth of films that have that. It's actually Tony Montana and his approach to those circumstances that stands out so much and people seem to identify with or enjoy. So we focused that. And as we'll go forward, you'll see that keep coming up, that became our core filter and our core constraint, is that would Tony Montana do that? And we can work towards, are we empowering that character, and is that character basically the IP? And we decided that he was. And that gave us a focal point then for everything we were putting towards it. What that led to, though, in identifying who our potential audience was, is it led to then getting cross-promotions with other agencies that had a similar audience. Bodog is still a very bizarre one to me, so I won't pretend to understand fully how that works, but apparently gambling ties in somehow. It was actually something that would tie in more had we continued the story further. We just, of course, scope and reality and everything. So Tony never got to own the casinos we had hoped for, but it was in the long stretch goal of the design. The general part of it, though, with Def Jam is that we actually were able to integrate that into our systems and into our core gameplay. So that cross-promotion was very, very rich, because we were able to have songs that hadn't been released yet as part of the things you unlocked for accomplishing things during the course of the game. And that gave us something kind of new to work with, and felt that it was an advantage to separate us a bit in the marketplace. So that was nice. So basically what we covered so far is that. So looking at effectively clarifying what's off limits, what can you use, what can't you, defining your reality of your schedule and time and budget, and then really figuring out who it is that when you come up with questions like, well, can we use Hulk Hogan? No. Okay, well, who says no? Is it internal, and which obviously you're going to stop gaps internally, but is it external? Who ultimately is the buck stop for any particular license concern? because with dealing with an established IP, that is key. You have to identify who those there are. And I've come into projects later where a lot of the questions that should have been asked front-loaded weren't asked. And it becomes critical as you're trying to tie up missions and stuff, and you're like, well, can we do this with this character or not? Because some mechanic didn't come true or some aspect wasn't built, we're stitching around it. And I'm not talking about RE here. I'm talking about other projects I've been on. RE is perfect. Don't fire me. Yeah, so that's basically that. And where we're going is, and we've already started to touch on this a little bit, is what makes an IP particular. By determining your constraints, you start to get a sense of what is it about your IP that you're using. To use the Scarface example, while we picked Tony Montana, and that was the good choice to make, it could have just easily, we could have gone with, no, it's more about the Scarface entity of empire building, it's about having lots of cars and lots of other stuff, and made that the critical focus. And while that was something that influenced the mechanics and the things that we did, it wasn't the focus of the IP, it wasn't the core of it. It was more of, well, would Tony have that kind of car? Or would he have a driver? Yes, that makes sense. He does that a lot in the film. Those sorts of things. So with any IP that you're taking on, you need to really think about what is the juice of that I'm transferring over, because it's not a literal play that experience, because that experience already exists. If you're translating a book, well, reading the book is the book. So are you just, because it was a book, you're going to put a page turning mechanic in your game? I guess you could, but that's not exactly what it's about. It's who is the narrative character that drives it, or the story element that drives it, or the action element that drives it, the antagonist that drives it. What is it that's the absolute brass tacks part of that IP that makes it worth making an interactive experience out of? And if you can identify that, then you can make a game around it that has consequence and meaning and will engage the player, regardless of what genre you're sitting in. Obviously, you have some genre concerns, like to make a shooter that has no guns might be a little strange, but who knows? Innovation. And then we're going to go forward and talk about filters, and that's the meaty part that I really, really want to get us to. And then I want us to, basically, I'd like us to play through making deciding and designing an IP real quick and taking it to a filter and defining what that is. So basically some pratfalls that I personally have fallen into over the years and had to then, and wasted a lot of time on. And I just want to call this out right off the bat. Now, who here knows what a Me Too product is? That's totally industry jargon. One hand. So a Me Too is essentially, Me Too is when you're looking at another game, like, okay, ooh, Arkham Asylum is awesome, so we'll do that, but it'll be this IP. And like, well, it's a very cheap way to sell something and get a budget. It's a really horrible way to design a game. It's great to have benchmarks and milestone and things, not milestone, but benchmarks and mile markers that you're looking at and going, okay, cool, they've sort of set a standard. A lot of users are playing that game will understand if we do this mechanic choice, or if we use this interface choice, or we do this button combo. There's always a bit of a risk of like, well, how far is that? Because it's emulation, or is it derivative and whatever. Basically, Me Too means that you're just copying it and putting a different face on it. And it immediately invalidates the product. It's a dangerous place to be. Sometimes you're forced into that situation. There were elements of Captain America that I won't lie. The marketing people coming back were basically, it's Arkham Asylum with Captain America. And as much as we fought to try and give the game as much integrity to itself as possible, we had less than a year to develop that, and in the actual production cycle, not the IP development. And it was the combat system. It's a little bit more robust in some ways from Arkham Asylum, but it's a lot of similarities too. It was a lot of relying on the audience is going to know what this is and be comfortable with it from get-go. And I think that was a bit of a struggle over the course of it to really get more of the individual identity of Captain America in there and a little bit less of it's a Me Too. On don't try to be whatever game killer. When we picked up the Scarface license, there was a lot of buzz among some of the marketing folks that we were working with that were like, oh, you're being a GTA killer. Well, no, it's really, I mean, we're in this similar space because we're open world and we're dealing with empire building and we're dealing with some of those things. But initially going after trying to just design it basically to catch up and Me Too on every design they had was a horrible way to go about trying to make a game. Well, they've got cars, we have to have cars. They have a helicopter, we have to have a helicopter. They've got speedboats, we have to have speedboats. They have, and you start laundry listing like that. And again, it's fine to understand where your market space is, but and the price of entry mechanics. Are you familiar with that term, price of entry? There's certain basic expectations in a genre for things you would have in the game, and if you don't, then you're going to have to really have something better in there otherwise, which is a nice challenge for designers, I think. So it's really a bad way to go about designing a game. It's more about what is the particular integrity of our game, which there it is, the word integrity, is establish your game's individual merit and integrity. For us, we decided it was all about using Tony Montana, as in be Tony Montana. And the more you were like him and making the choices that he would make, or as were demonstrated in the film, other than his drug addiction, then the more rewarded you were. The better you did, the quicker you got through things, the more, where you had other choices that you could do things that would be a bit more crafty or thuggish or emergent, and that was totally fine, but the rewards would be less or would be harder to get because you weren't doing it the way he would have done it. Which, frankly, the more we studied the character, the craftier he actually was, and the more he used minions and henchmen and that sort of stuff, and that led to a lot of discovery about new mechanics that we brought in later in the production, and about what happens when you start to rise up and you get people to do things for you, which was nice because it helped to solve and automate some of the things that get very tedious in your typical empire building game. Why should I have to go pick up all the money all the time? Let someone else do it. Well, that's something you can buy as a service. That makes sense because that's something he did. Those classic shots of the vans with the sea bags full of money. And that's basically what I'm trying to say, is that you have to define how you're approaching the IP and what the integrity of that is. What is the core element that you're going to push through? And the last thing, or not last thing, but the thing I want to really call out here is don't heap on design for design's sake, which you're going to hear probably a lot in the course of your career. Maybe not. I've heard it a lot, but that's often because I have a lot of pet mechanics that I like, but they don't suit the IP that I'm putting them into. So I'm guilty of putting far too many collectibles into Captain America because I was playing the hell out of Fallout, and I love collecting stuff. And I thought, well, everybody that plays will really enjoy it because we've got this big Bavarian castle and people are going to love finding all this stuff. And if you find 5 of this and 5 of this and 5 of this, it unlocks this and then you get this. And there are little systems to it and whatever. And yeah, a handful of reviewers noted it, thought it was fun. But it really got in the way of the typical sort of action player who just wanted to beat the hell out of stuff. That's more what the game was about. That's what they wanted. That's what the Arkham players certainly were coming for. And okay, so we put a lot of time into that for something that really gave us kind of a minimal or mixed return. And it's because it was a pet mechanic of mine. It's my bad. So I would encourage that even though you have kind of a toolkit of things that as a designer you can rely on, this is a great compulsion loop, people love to collect, people like those things, stop and really look at the IP that you're working with and make sure that the mechanics that you're putting on the table or thinking about throwing down aren't just the laundry list of what you expect to have. Well, we have to have a car and a gun and it has to do this and this and this. Really think about what would be appropriate for the IP. Does Tony need a car? Does Tony need to drive at all? He only drives once in the entire film, as far as I remember, and everywhere else, he's always driven by someone else. So, and that, again, for us, became important later on. You're important when someone else drives you. Yeah. So, when we're going into constraints, and I'm going to go through this very quickly because I don't have a lot of time, but basically, with the constraints, once you've identified where the playground that you're working within, that's when you can start getting creative. Because that's when you can really go and dig in on what's now the allowable turf. For Scarface, it's taking place in a particular point in time. It has a whole, because I broke the script down to try and figure out what the timeline for it was, because after the beginning of the film, they don't throw up another date. And by the sequence of events and kind of how realistically some of those stuff would take, it effectively spanned about 2.5 years. Cool, that gives me a period of time that we're working with. I went and then read the DEA website on the history of drug trade and trafficking in the US and where it was coming from. And that gave me inspiration for missions and locations and some persona, like locations like Norman's Cay, and different sorts of people that were responsible, because essentially at the end of the film, the reason they came to kill him at the mansion was because he had thwarted his supplier. He needs a new supplier. Boom, we've got it. Basically, our first arc of our game is him getting a new supplier because he's going to focus on distribution. So then, does that make sense? Is what I'm going for is basically digging in and thinking, okay, between time period, characters, cameos, characters from the film, who can I use, who can I use, how can I empower their backstories, because the film just glosses over them like a casting call, and what can I do with that? That gives me a whole giant bucket of stuff to work with. Awesome. Now what can we do with it? And that's where filters come into it. Filter is basically a way to screen, I apologize for the graphic. I didn't have time to draw something really clever, but it does get the point across. Is that you're basically taking a whole just wall of sound of all the stuff that fits within your constraints. So for me, on Captain America, it was everything Captain America. On You know, and it doesn't even have to be that specific. If we're getting into, well, Resident Evil, oh my goodness, because I came in later in production, so I suddenly had to catch up with everybody else has been spending all this time on and learn everything and find out what's allowable and not, da da da. And it's just, you know, massive. And the bigger and older the IP is, the more there is to kind of soak up and potentially use. But you need at some point to start filtering that down to what is actually functional for the game. What are the good designs? What are the best designs? And start prioritizing them. So for Scarface, Tony Montana became the #1 filter. Since we decided that he was the key part of the IP, we were able to then say, okay, we'll filter everything through him first. Would Tony Montana do that? It suddenly became very easy to go, well, no. Would he beat puppies? No. Would he kill seals? No. So you could start extracting stuff. Would he be a pimp? No. So moral code problem, and then Al Pacino would get pissed. So no. So we can start weaning out those things and say, okay, well, what would he do? Well, he's a distributor, so he needs to build a distribution network. Lofty goals, okay, he starts spreading out of Miami, though, into other cities. So initially we were going to do multiple cities. Then, of course, you look at production scope, and you look and that constraint says no. And so you go back to, okay, it's going to be just Miami and some islands. And okay, cool. And originally it was going to be Mexico, and then no, let's reduce that back. Because in history, Mexico started to take on the trade versus the coming through the Bahamas and the Caymans. So you know, I learned way too much about that stuff. And neat. So that's basically what you're doing, is you're setting up filters. Now the important thing here is it's not just one filter. You're going to have multiple filters, and it's going to depend on how you're working through. Now over the course of production, you'll be throwing them away and making new ones. Your core IP should always be a persistent filter that lasts throughout. And as that takes life and shape and form and you nurture it, it's going to become a clearer, more focused filter, and it'll work for you. But otherwise, you're going to have things like combat and what's for your guns, or for your however your interactions are, for your tech. What are the filters for that? Is that a feature we need to build or not? Well, what do we measure against? We measure against the IP. Okay, great. Yeah, we definitely need that feature. He should be able to drive. But then you get into, but should he be able to shoot from a car? Well, GTA has it. That's great. Do we need it? So you look at at that kind of thing, and you look at what's the tech debt that's going to be. And so you have filters for all sorts of things, and then you look, okay, well, we have guns, and then we're going to have cars, but then do we have those together? And then you look at, okay, that's called chaining. Chaining filters, where you filter the object or the content first just by figuring out that it suits the IP, and then you start to filter it against the reality checks of your budget, your time, the mechanics, and work through those. And that should help you to take all that plethora of content that you've come up with for ideas and inspiration and mission and locations and characters and everything, and really pare that down to the stuff that's the best bang for buck. And that ultimately is what this is about. It's both pre-production technique, but throughout production, you need to keep checking your content against your filters and looking to see, is this still valid? We've spent 2 weeks longer on this feature than we intended to. Is this still valid? Does this still make sense for our game? Or should we turf it before we waste more time on it and money, because everything is money, and then suddenly fall behind on something else or not serve something else that would have been better for the IP? So that's a filter. I learned about filters from an art director, believe it or not, that has nothing to do with game design. I've just liberated that and put it to game design, and I found it's worked really well for me over the past 5-6 years since I learned about it. Does the design make sense for the IP? Does it empower the IP? Does it empower the player inside the experience? This is extremely important. It's really easy to lose sight of your player while you're designing. And it's a critical thing to just step back from what you're working on, try to get an objective view, in effect be a filter of sorts, and think, if I were the player, would I dig this? And why? And you're not making the game for you, but try to take that. And also it's important to watch people play. You get builds, watch people play. I love watching people play because no one plays the way I do. Generally, they play better. And I learn a lot from seeing what they do. I learn from seeing what they exploit. I learn from seeing the corners they turn, things they avoid, things they don't care about. It's extremely beneficial. So in scope and quality, that's pretty much self-explanatory. Big thing, too, of course, is that your publisher stays happy with you and keeps paying you. That's always important. So we're going to get into a little bit of audience participation here in just a second. And what basically this is awesome. I have this whole deck printed out, and I had help with it, and I didn't actually need it that much. But what I want to do really quick is just to sum up that you are taking an IP from someone else that people have put effort into, and you're going to turn that into something else. You're basically, it's not a port, but you're taking things from one medium to another, or if it's a game, you're still taking it forward into something else. And you need to really respect that. So part of identifying your constraints, coming up with these filters, really researching what that IP is and all the potential it has, both in context to itself and in context to its place in history, into the time period it reflects, the architecture, the landscape, the characters, whatever, that when you're taking all that in, you're helping to basically bring up build the IP's individual identity and its personality. And by doing that, you give it an integrity that carries through to the end user, if that makes sense. So it's extremely important to take the time to really do that. It's just, I've been on too many projects where no one really, they kind of just, oh, we're going to go, and we're going to make this thing. And it's, instead of, just take a little bit of time to step back and look at the greater context of where what you're making is going to sit in the world, and then define its world accordingly. Okay, so if anybody has an idea, I would like to hear of an obscure non-video game IP that we would like to make a game out of. Just shout it out, I'll pick the loudest one. There's already a game for Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm gonna go with Doctor Who. I'm sorry. My Pretty Pony is so tempting, but you know, Robot Chicken's already rocked them pretty well, so I'm gonna let that go. All right, so Doctor Who, one of my personal favorites. So right off the bat, we have an issue with who owns that. Okay. So then the next question, so who owns it? All right, cool, BBC. I'm using BBC. This probably won't show up. Doesn't matter anyway. So we're going to think about who owns it. Then you think about which Doctor Who are we talking about? Only like 16, 17 of them? 11, sorry. I lost track after Tom Baker. So see which one's P to me. So we're going to say Tom Baker. We're going to do Tom Baker. I know, I'm going to make you guys mad. Cool. Are we going to have, which of his female sidekicks are we going to use, or that male one that was there for a bit? Are we going to use K9? There's a whole bunch of characters. Which key monsters are we going to use? Are the Cybermen going to be in there, the Daleks? Which ones are we going to use? So I've totally steered this into a topic I actually know a little bit about, so sorry about that. I don't know any Pony characters. But basically, and I'm not going to write all that down, but just like that's what we start thinking about is when we talk about researching, you're talking about, okay, and also, you know, if we're using Tom Baker, well, he was on TV at a particular time. Are we going to bring him forward and have him in the present, or are we going to be using the time frame that when the shows were actually on? Because they were filming on location a lot in the different city streets and that kind of thing. And okay, so are we going to be building a landscape? Are we just going to stick to alien landscapes? How many worlds are we going to have? Are we using ones that are on the more iconic episodes? Which are the most popular episodes? Which are the ones that people talk about the most or dress up like? Which villains are the most? Those are all the questions that you should be pooling together while you're identifying your constraints and doing your research and thinking about it. Does that make sense? So the next thing you do then is you identify what is the core aspect of the IP. Does anybody have a suggestion?
Time travel.
Time travel is very good. So we're just going to put time. The Doctor, the TARDIS, I think. Okay. There's an interesting thing that was always interesting to me is the fact that when they change to the next one, and that there's a whole bunch of them, but then there's competition with them, and there's this sort of overarching story of the struggle between them and something else, regardless of all the sort of day-to-day stuff or whatever. And do you get into that or not? I mean, you know, do we bring out? Okay. So yeah, time. TARDIS. There's a whole game about the TARDIS breaking down. Is that your primary thing? That's a horrible handwriting, and I apologize. Let's just make a box. There we go. Police windows. Okay, cool. And then over here, we've got a clock. All right. Are those the key things, or are that the most important filters? The TARDIS is fairly general. Solutions without violence. That's where we're getting into. That's what changes it up. Solve without killing or violence. Let's do violence. Violence, which I can't spell. All right, cool. So sorry, that's what, you know, so let's, and for the moment I'm gonna say TARDIS is our key component. The reason I picked that then is well then it's not about Tom Baker. Then we could say, well, it's TARDIS. So maybe we have multiple Doctor Who's show up, and the game follows the course of the TARDIS when it goes through different owners and how that happens. I mean, this is all spitballing, but it's just like you have to sort of figure these things out. Because when you pick one of those as this is it, the game centers around this, because it needs to. You have to have something at the very center of your cosmos that you're creating, or it just all spins off. That was a horrible analogy, but you know what I'm saying. So that's what I think is the key lesson here, is that then you come down to filters. And the filters would be the TARDIS, is your key filter if it's your core of your IP. Tom Baker, if you're focusing on him, would be one of your filters. The mechanics, if you're saying it's solving without violence, well, how do we do that? What do we do as solving without violence? Stealth could be. Exactly. Those are all, exactly, puzzles, conversations, stealth. Those are all things you could do, and those become core mechanics then. And you start to work down and laundry list those, prioritize them, and then filter them back against each other and against the core, the TARDIS. Is stealth really that important for the TARDIS? Well, yeah, you just don't want to leave it sitting out on the street, somebody will come and tow it away. So those sorts of things. And work through it. Is K9, would just be a fun Easter egg, or is that actually a core mechanic? Is using K9 part of your stealth, because he goes underneath the things that would catch you? Daleks can't see that low, I don't know. So that's the stuff you need to figure out, if that makes sense. So that's basically how you would get to a filter and how you would use them in a very kind of sloppy, quick example. Basically, that's the summary, is to identify the constraints of your IP, right there. Don't heap on design for design's sake. And define your filters. I really can't stress that enough, that it's a very simple mechanic. What I'm bringing here today is not rocket science at all, trust me. But it is something that I've been on project after project after project and seen not have happened. And it's fundamental to pre-production, but it's also useful throughout production, to just keep boiling down to what is the core of our game, how are we actually hitting and addressing that core, or are we just getting a bunch of extra stuff that doesn't really tie in that well? Because at the end, we have to serve the user. We also have to serve the publisher and get paid, but we need this to sell well. And I personally believe that products that have more integrity to themselves sell better and get better Metacritic, and those are all important things. And the last thing is, I had to get at least one piece of my art in there, so forgive me. But basically, any questions, please?
I know when you were working on Scarface, you made the decision to have like Tony Montana live after that final scene. Mm-hmm. So what was the decision there? Like, instead of just recreating the movie, like, you had to wonder about how do you do that without destroying the integrity of that iconic scene? Mm-hmm. Like, how do you do that without pissing off the fans? How do you, like, basically, what can you do within the constraints of the IP, like, creatively? We
argued about that for 3 or 4 months. There were a lot of meetings, and meetings with publishers and marketing and all sorts of stuff. Do we do a prequel? Do we tell the movie? Do we, which, I mean, there's parts of the movie that really aren't that exciting. I mean, I mean, not to be mean, but they're just like, okay, he buys his sister a hair salon during a music montage. Is that really, ooh, it informed some of our mechanics, but it's not really like, ooh, that mission's gonna be awesome. You know, it wasn't that useful. So what we finally came down to is that what would the fans enjoy most? And like, well, most fans and most quotes and samples seem to relate to that ending scene. And it's not just the sheer violence of it, it's his presence in that scene. So why not empower, basically kick the game off with him being in that situation, and the only difference being that the player now has the ability to, because I remember when I watched the film the second or third time, and I'm just like, the dude's right behind you, turn around. And I'm like, so we set that up. And you've got a window where you can turn around and blow the guy away, and now you're not gonna get shot in the back with a shotgun. Yeah, you are high on coke and shot 40 times, but whatever. And you know, it's a game. We can get away with that a little better than reality can. So, and then you survive. Well, now it's a what if. What if he had lived? Well, he goes to the Caymans, he dries out for a few months, he gets over his addictions, he swears off coke, and he becomes back to be a distributor and rebuild his empire and go. So now not only has it given us a groundwork, it's empowered his character and it's got him back to some of the things that were appealing about him in the first place before he became a coke fiend. So as much as his speech about make way for the bad guy was cool, it gave us, that also was somewhat drug-fueled. So we wanted to basically make it that if his context says he was angry and gave us the bad guy aspect, it was for a reason. It was because he was better than the other bad guys, the lesser of two evils or whatever, just to make him empathetic. Because otherwise he's just a killing machine, and that's not really that interesting. It was also interesting that a lot of our fans were really keen on having a chainsaw, and he never actually uses the chainsaw in the film. So we tied into that and made sure that we put the chainsaw in the very room that it's in the film, that we have that hotel recreated, that we have, but the situation's completely different. And it's up to the player whether or not he's going to pick to use that. We don't force you to use that ever. But then, and then later in our story, we introduce it as something he actually has one. But it's key and yada. So servicing the IP, it made sense to do it that way. Cool, all right, one more, make it a really good one. I see a hand there. I see, oh, sorry, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry. So you made mention of the collectibles as a great compulsion loop that was awesome, but didn't really fit into the game idea that you're currently working with.
Yep.
So I want to know some examples of other effective compulsion loops, like for combat or movement or anything else that you actually use.
There's lots. I don't want to give away all my secrets.
Yeah.
You'll forgive me. But and I would encourage you to read postmortems on Game Sutra and other things like that, because it's a good learning curve. But anytime that you can feed into people feeling like they're getting a short-term goal, a mid-term goal, and a long-term goal, you've won. Every game well, not every game, I shouldn't say that, but any game that actually has room to have long-term goals. If you're not giving short-term payoffs, the player doesn't get those little encouragements, those little, and then you get the mid-term one, they're like, okay, but if I finish this mission arc, I get something really nice payoff. And then you get the big giant ones. And I mean, it's a huge game, but Skyrim and most of the Bethesda stuff is an example of that. It's why I get so drawn into them. Because sure, I can run around and stockpile stuff. Like, for some reason, Fallout, I collect all the teddy bears. I have no idea why. And gnomes. I have tons of gnomes. There's nothing associated with that. I just do it because I'm compulsive. But it's there, and it's a nice, rewarding thing. Cool. In their environment, it makes more sense. It doesn't distract from anything or whatever. But in terms of the mission structures, there's lots of little like step and fetch stuff, but then, and that's short-term goal. It's a short-term payoff. It helps me level up. Then there's longer stuff that ties in, like Skyrim. There's the whole Champions arc, and it just keeps building and building and building, and eventually ties into a bigger story. And it's, again, it's very epic, but you can do that on any scale of game. You just need to think, what is your short-term goal? What is immediately satisfying? What's my quick beer after work or whatever? And then what's your midterm goal? Not that I encourage you to drink, just designers tend to. The midterm goal of what do I get out of that, at the end of the week? A big belly, I need to go run. And then what do you get long term? I met my wife when I was drunk. So hey, there you go, all right. But anyway, yeah.
Great, thank you.
I guess we're out of time, I'm sorry. But I want to point out that I'm going to be taking, there's a whole lot more case examples and stuff as I wrote this that, I think I'm losing my mic, that I wanted to use. So I basically decided that rather than kind of, because some of you will be interested, some of you won't, that I put it together into a blog, and I'll be posting that in a couple of days. That'll be there, so if you want to really dig in. And there's my email, and I'll also be putting this PPT, the PowerPoint file up there for download. So yeah, again, so basically just to answer any questions you have, feel free to email me. I'm happy to talk about design until the moon falls over. So yeah, thank you very much.